Here is your aviation weather outlook for Alaska as we go into this weekend. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan, and looking at the situation here for Saturday morning, we're going to have an area of low pressure late this Friday night, early Saturday morning, cross the eastern Aleutians, and then head up toward Kuskokwim Bay with a central pressure down around 975 millibars. This system will be accompanied by a front that extends east and northeastward, and it'll be pressing further northward across the southern mainland and eastward into the Gulf. This is going to increase precipitation here across south central, the northern Gulf Coast as we go through the day Saturday. IFR conditions are anticipated Saturday morning in the northern Panhandle, areas of the middle upper Yukon Valley, areas of the southwest interior, just west of the Alaska Range. And then for Saturday afternoon, you can see IFR conditions from areas of the west coast, lower Yukon Delta, Nunavik Island, all the way eastward out into the Gulf. Much of the central western Gulf encompassed in IFR, as well as areas along the northern half of the Panhandle and the inner coastal mountains. For Sunday, low pressure will be lifting up across the lower Yukon basin and then eventually up into Norton Sound and gradually weakening. The frontal boundary arches out ahead all the way through the southern mainland and into the Panhandle, where extensive IFR conditions are anticipated through the central northern Panhandle, northeastern Gulf Coast, Yakutat, on up into the Wrangell St. Elias Mountains and to just south of the Alaska Range. Also, a broad area of IFR conditions here across the western and southwest mainland from the middle Yukon River down through the YK Delta and much of Norton Sound. For Sunday afternoon, we still see a broad area of IFR conditions across the west, including Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, extending eastward along the Brooks Range, just especially north of the Yukon River and areas of the central North Slope. Still pockets of IFR anticipated Sunday afternoon from along areas of the western arm of the Alaska Range in through the southeast inner coastal mountains and then down here along the inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. Pass conditions Saturday, Anatuvik Pass, MVFR conditions becoming VFR. Same thing, Adigan Pass, MVFR conditions becoming VFR. And then further south and west here in the west arm of the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR briefs early on, giving way to IFR conditions, especially as we go through later afternoon and evening. There will be some more precipitation associated with that frontal band, along with some gustier winds and turbulence associated with that. Rainy Pass, VFR becoming MVFR. Windy Pass should generally hang on to MVFR conditions Saturday. There could be a brief interval of VFR earlier in the day, but not likely to hold. Isabel Pass, MVFR conditions becoming VFR, and Mentasta Pass starting out with MVFR conditions becoming VFR. That'll be the same case across the Copper River Basin, though Tanita Pass may tend to hang on to MVFR conditions, so can't rule out a brief interval of VFR conditions Saturday. And then Portage Pass starts out VFR, but with that frontal boundary approaching from the southwest and the moisture moving inland, we expect ceilings to fall and precipitation to be developing, especially later Saturday into Saturday night. So IFR conditions will dominate. And then a continuation of IFR conditions are expected across the northern Panhandle, especially Chilkoot and White for Saturday. Looking at freezing levels at the surface, the freezing line should run out through the central Bering, dipping down into the central Alaska Peninsula along the coastline of the Kenai, and then along the northern and northeastern Gulf Coast in through the inner channels of the Panhandle Saturday morning. And notice ahead of the system, ahead of the front, we expect freezing levels aloft to bump upwards to 4,000 feet in the Gulf and 6,000 feet across the North Pacific, just signaling some warmer, moist air aloft associated with the system. So that translates along where the frontal boundary will be. The area of low pressure will be lifting up toward Kuskokwim Bay and then into the southwest interior as we go through Saturday afternoon and evening. And then with the front that's arcing out ahead of it, we expect the potential for moderate icing over areas of the southwest interior above 2,000 feet, especially west of the Alaska Range, and then areas around and above 4,000 feet across the Gulf, especially east of the Kenai coastline and extending up to the western coast here for the outer areas of the Panhandle, 4,000 to even 6,000 feet once you get out into the North Pacific. Jet stream level winds 30,000 feet. We have brought a trough here out over the Bering, general circulation of low pressure in this region. And we have strongest winds aloft south of the Aleutians and southeast of the Alaska Peninsula, jet max from the southwest up to 120 knots, pushing up into the lower Gulf. And then another broad band of westerlies, northwest Canada, 90 to 115 knots. Bringing it down to 700 millibars, around 9,000 feet. We see the low circulation here, just south of the Atollin Strait and just west of Kuskokwim Bay. Pretty good winds coming up into the Gulf, especially around the Kenai Peninsula, lifting up to the Alaska Range, pockets of 60 to 70 knot southerly winds. So there will be turbulence along this area of the Alaska Range at higher elevations above 10,000 feet. And then bringing it down to 3,000 feet, just a bit above the surface, we find strongest winds across the Gulf. We'll find areas, Kayak Island there, 50 knots, 60 knots possible coming in there. The entrance of Cook Inlet and then toward Lake Iliamna. We also have a broad belt of west-southwest winds south of the low, 50 to 60 knots, pushing into the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula. And then on the north side of the circulation of the low, we find an area of winds 45 to 55 knots covering much of the area of the lower Yukon Basin, south side of Norton Sound. And this is going to translate to broad areas of moderate turbulence. We expect moderate turbulence all the way from far western areas of the Brooks Range and, say, Point Hope, all the way south through the Seward Peninsula, surface to 3,000 feet, and then here in the southwest interior, surface to 4,000 feet. There's the potential for isolated severe turbulence there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. Also coming into Bristol Bay and just on the north side of the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula, especially there just north of Cold Bay. As a stronger belt, those westerly winds coming in there, surface to 4,000 feet and then trailing out along the Aleutian chain, some moderate turbulence, surface to 3,000 feet. So definitely could encounter some bumpy conditions there across much of the western, southwestern portion of the mainland, extending into the northern Gulf all the way back down through the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians.